Ruth Lacey's world had collapsed to the circumference of her skull, buried neck-deep in Wyoming hardpan, like a grotesque flower, blooming in reverse. The October sun hammered down with biblical fury, each ray a white-hot needle piercing her blistered scalp. The earth pressed against her chest with the weight of 10 coffins, each breath a battle won against suffocation by will alone. Mama's voice singing Amazing Grace, while fever consumed her. The memory flickered like candlelight in Ruth's failing consciousness. Papa reading scripture by lamplight, his voice gentle before the world turned cruel. These fragments of warmth were all that remained, hoarded like coins against the approaching darkness of a death that would take hours, maybe days, to complete its work. Her swollen tongue clicked against cracked lips as she tried to swallow. The taste of blood and alkali dust filled her mouth at the flavor of her own dissolution. Soon the ravens would come, then the coyotes. Jacob's righteous tribunal had planned even that detail, ensuring her body would be scattered across the Badlands as a warning to other women who dared fail in their sacred duties. Lord, forgive this barren vessel. Jacob Lacey's voice echoed in her memory from an hour past when he'd stood over her grave like a prophet delivering final judgment. May her suffering purify what sin has made unclean. The rope around her throat had loosened when he'd mounted his horse, but the earth held her fast with the grip of a lover who would never let go. Every inhalation was stolen territory conquered from the crushing weight of soil that seemed to grow heavier with each labored breath. I will not die like this, she promised herself, though the promise felt as hollow as her chest beneath tons of packed dirt. I will not let him bury the truth with my bones. A scorpion emerged from a crack in the hardpan near her left temple, its segmented tail curved like a question mark against the merciless sky. Ruth watched it with the detached fascination of the dying, envying its purposeful movements, its honest hunger so different from human cruelty. The creature sought only survival. There was purity in that, an integrity Jacob's righteousness could never match. Through the heat shimmer, she thought she glimpsed her sister Mary's face, sweet Mary, who'd run off with a drifter 3 summers past, though Ruth had found her torn dress by the river and bloodstains on the rocks. Another woman erased by Jacob's version of divine justice, another truth buried deeper than any grave. Sarah McKenna's laughter from before Jacob poisoned her mind with fear. The memory brought fresh agony, not physical pain, but the crushing weight of complicity. If Ruth had spoken sooner, fought harder, refused to be silenced by marriage vows and scripture. But such thoughts were luxuries for the living. Ruth was dying by degrees, her body shutting down system by system as dehydration carved its slow path through her organs. Her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like tide water. Soon she would join Mary, join Sarah, join all the women Jacob had silenced in service of his twisted vision of righteousness. The vultures had begun their descent landing just beyond her sight, with wet, rustling sounds that spoke of infinite patience. They knew what men like Jacob Lacey left behind. They had feasted before, but as consciousness wavered like smoke in the thin air, Ruth Lacey carved a promise into her fading thoughts with the precision of a gravestone inscription. If somehow, impossibly, I survive this hole in the ground, I will speak every buried truth, even if it kills me all over again. Every secret, every lie, every woman who died to feed his appetite for control. I will be the voice the dead never had. The earth pressed against her ribs like an embrace that would never end. But Ruth's heart kept beating with the stubborn rhythm of someone who refused to let death have the final word. Not yet. Not while her story remained untold. Bo McKenna had been having the same conversation with ghosts for 3 years, and the dead had grown tired of his self-pity. Lost another steer to wolves, he reported to the weathered cross on the bluff overlooking his failing ranch. Wind whistled through gaps in the wooden marker he'd carved from juniper, carrying the scent of coming winter and his own failure. Banks sent another letter. Reckon you picked a good time to get out Sarah. The October wind carried his words away like smoke, offering no absolution for the guilt that had hollowed him out from the inside. Sarah's grave held no answers, only the endless silence of the wrong dead. She'd walked into the river, carrying their unborn child, driven to madness by Jacob Lacey's whispered poison about contamination and divine displeasure. Your association with that barren woman will curse your baby, Jacob had told her. Ruth Lacey's sin will spread like plague to your innocent child. Week after week, visit after visit, until Sarah couldn't sleep for fear of damning their unborn son through kindness to the wrong woman. Bo spat into the dust-tasting bitterness and whiskey from breakfast. At 41, he felt ancient, his dark hair prematurely silver, his face carved to leather by years of squinting into unforgiving light. The scar along his jaw, Jacob's signature cut with a broken bottle during their final confrontation, caught the afternoon sun like a pale accusation he'd carry to his own grave. He should have killed Jacob then, when grief was fresh and his conscience clear. Should have put a bullet in the man who'd murdered his wife, with scripture and superstition. Instead, he'd let the community exile him to this wasteland between settlements where he could waste away in peace and self-recrimination. Jasper, his aging gelding, shifted restlessly beneath him, ears pricked toward something Bo couldn't see. The horse had been acting strange all afternoon, sidling and snorting at shadows that might have been heat mirages or something more substantial. "Easy, boy," Bo murmured, but his own nerves were starting to fray. 3 years of isolation had left him talking to ghosts and jumping at sounds that might be wolves or might be loneliness, finally cracking what remained of his sanity. That's when he saw it, a shimmer of movement in the Badlands that looked like a woman's head rising from the earth itself. Mirage, he told himself. Desert playing tricks on a fool who spent too long alone. But Jasper saw it too, whinnying with distress as they approached the impossible vision. It wasn't a mirage. It blinked. Ruth Lacey lay buried to her neck in ground packed hard as concrete, her dark hair matted with blood and alkali dust. Only her eyes moved, tracking his approach with the desperate hope of the drowning. The earth around her throat had been tamped down with methodical precision, the work of men who understood soil mechanics and the mathematics of suffering. Bo slid from his saddle boots, hitting earth with a sound like judgment. "Jesus Christ. How long you been here?" Her lips moved, soundlessly swollen tongue clicking like a broken clock. This wasn't random cruelty, but something colder, more purposeful. Something that wore the mask of righteousness while practicing calculated barbarity. He began clawing at the hardpan with bare hands, fingernails splitting against clay that might as well have been stone. Each handful of dirt revealed more damage-torn dress rope burns, bruises that mapped a careful geography of violence. Someone had beaten her savagely before burying her alive, then left her to die by degrees under the merciless sun. "Easy now," he murmured, though whether to her or himself remained unclear. Sweat stung his eyes as he worked muscles burning with effort that seemed to accomplish nothing against earth packed tight as mortar. When he finally freed her from the ground's embrace, she collapsed against him, like kindling wrapped in cloth. Bo lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, how thoroughly someone had whittled her down to essence and stubborn will. Her body was a catalog of systematic cruelty, old scars layered beneath fresh wounds, the accumulated evidence of years spent married to a monster. The ride back to his ranch stretched 3 miles through sage and scattered hope. Ruth drifted between consciousness and fever dreams, muttering fragments that chilled his blood. "Shouldn't have seen Anna. Promised I would keep quiet. Forgive me, Sarah." Sarah's name on the dying woman's lips hit Bo like a physical blow. What connection could there be between his dead wife and Jacob Lacey's buried one? His ranch house squatted against the horizon, like a wounded animal, weathered timber, and broken promises held together by stubbornness and insufficient credit. The barn roof leaked starlight and snow in equal measure, gaps that reminded him daily of dreams deferred and debts unpaid. This was what remained of his grand plans, his promises to Sarah that they'd build something lasting in this hostile country. He carried Ruth inside and laid her on the kitchen table, where he'd once planned to carve Thanksgiving turkeys for dinners that never came. In lamplight, her injuries revealed their full scope, a constellation of violence that told the story of systematic, purposeful cruelty. But she was alive, breathing impossibly present in his kitchen like a resurrection he'd never asked for and didn't know how to handle. As he cleaned her wounds with gentle precision, recognition struck him like lightning to a lonely tree. The bone structure beneath the swelling, the shape of her hands, and the way she held her head, even in unconsciousness. He'd seen this woman before from a distance, during his brief visits to the settlement before Jacob had him banished. Ruth Lacey, Jacob Lacey's wife, the woman whose screams had echoed across the settlement when Jacob pronounced God's judgment on her barren womb. The woman whose mysterious disappearance had been explained as wolves, divine predators sent to devour the unworthy. Bo's hands stilled on the bloodied cloth. His wife's murderer's wife lay unconscious on his table, delivered by providence or cruel joke into his care. Every instinct screamed revenge, justice, the settling of old scores in the only currency this country understood. How easy it would be to load her back on Jasper, return her to the grave she'd crawled out of, let Jacob's righteous justice take its course. But staring down at her battered face, Bo McKenna made a choice that would haunt him forever. Instead of vengeance, he chose mercy. Instead of justice, he chose the harder path of hope. He carried Ruth to the bedroom where Sarah had died and laid her on sheets that still smelled of lavender and lost dreams. Then he retreated to his kitchen to contemplate the magnitude of his decision mistake, or salvation, he couldn't yet tell. Outside, the wind began to howl with the voice of approaching winter. Somewhere in its sound, Bo could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice, not condemning, but approving at last of a choice he'd never have made while she lived. The question now was whether mercy would prove stronger than the hatred that had sustained him through 3 years of guilt and isolation. Inciting incident. Ruth woke to the sound of coffee percolating and the alien sensation of warmth without pain. For a terrifying moment, she thought herself back in Jacob's bed, but the hands that had touched her wounds were too gentle, the silence too complete. No sounds of morning prayers or muttered condemnations, no weight of judgment pressing down like a gravestone on her chest. Through the bedroom doorway, she glimpsed a lean figure moving with careful economy around what appeared to be a kitchen. The smell of bacon joined the coffee, creating an atmosphere so domestic it seemed like hallucination born of fever and desperation. "You're awake." The voice belonged to Bo McKenna. She knew his story the way everyone in the territory knew the cautionary tales Jacob loved to tell. The faithless rancher who'd lost his wife to divine displeasure and been cast out to waste away in exile. The scar along his jaw was Jacob's handiwork, carved during their final confrontation over Sarah's treatment. "Please," Ruth whispered, her voice barely more than breath scraping over damaged vocal cords. "Don't send me back." McKenna studied her with dark eyes that held depths she couldn't navigate. He carried a coffee cup in hands that looked capable of violence or tenderness in equal measure, and Ruth had no compass for determining which she was facing. In her world, men were either predators or prey masters or servants. McKenna seemed to exist somewhere between categories, in a space she'd never learned to read. "I know who you are," he said finally, his voice carrying the flat affect of a man who'd made decisions he wasn't sure about. "Question is what I'm supposed to do about it." Ruth searched his expression for some hint of his intentions, but McKenna's face was territory mapped by pain and marked by choices she couldn't understand. The morning light streaming through his window caught the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and conversations with ghosts. "He'll come looking," she said, each word a razor blade in her throat. "Jacob won't let this stand. He can't afford to. Why would he care about a wife he was happy to bury alive? The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that could destroy everything Jacob had built. Ruth closed her eyes, remembering his final words over her grave. Let her suffering purify what sin has made unclean. But there was more to it, complexities that could hang him if they surfaced. Because I know things, she said quietly, meeting his gaze directly. Things that could topple his whole kingdom of lies. McKenna set down his coffee with deliberate care, and Ruth saw something flicker in his expression. Interest, perhaps, or recognition of opportunity. Your husband killed my wife, drove her to take her own life with his poison preaching. Why shouldn't I finish what he started and put you back in that hole where he wanted you? Ruth felt her heart hammering against ribs that still ached from the earth's crushing embrace. This was the crucial moment, the choice that would determine whether she lived to speak her truths or died with them buried in Wyoming hardpan. Because you're not him, she said, simply putting everything she had left into those 4 words. And because somewhere under all that hurt, you still remember what it felt like to choose kindness over justice. The silence stretched between them, filled with small sounds of a house settling into morning, the tick of a mantel clock, and the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the distant lowing of cattle that somehow still believed in the possibility of green grass and full bellies. McKenna turned toward the window, his profile sharp against pale light. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man making a choice he knew would change everything. There's a storm coming in from the north. You'll be safer in the root cellar until I figure out what to do with you. And if you decide to turn me in, then I'll make sure you get a fair trial before they stretch your neck. It wasn't comfort, but it was honesty, the first honest words any man had spoken to her in years. Ruth tested her legs, finding them weak but functional. The simple act of standing without permission, without fear of immediate punishment, felt like a small revolution. I can walk, she said. Good. Because come morning, half the territory will be looking for you. And I need time to decide whether I'm hiding a victim or harboring a murderer. He didn't wait for her response, disappearing back into the kitchen with movements that spoke of military training or years spent working alone. Ruth swung her legs over the side of the bed, fighting dizziness and the urge to collapse back into temporary safety. Outside, thunder growled across the Badlands, like God clearing his throat for another round of divine fury. The storm McKenna had mentioned was real, moving fast across country that amplified every sound and made the very air taste of electricity and change. But Ruth had survived worse than weather. The question now was whether she could survive the complicated mercy of a man who had every reason to want her dead, and every justification for finishing what Jacob had started. As she struggled to her feet, Ruth caught her reflection in a cracked mirror above McKenna's dresser. The woman looking back was a stranger, hollow-eyed, marked by violence, but undeniably alive. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time in her life, she was making choices rather than having them made for her. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Freedom, it seemed, was just another word for the responsibility to save your own life. The storm arrived like the wrath of an Old Testament God, turning the world into chaos of wind and water that made the yard a muddy battlefield. Bo led Ruth to the root cellar through sheets of rain that felt like bullets fired from heaven's own arsenal, each drop stinging exposed skin with the promise of hypothermia and worse to come. Food and water down there. He shouted over the wind's howl, his voice barely audible above nature's fury. Iron bar slides across the door, lock it from inside, and don't open it for anyone but me. Ruth descended wooden steps into darkness that smelled of earth and stored provisions of survival hoarded against lean times and leaner hopes. The cellar was larger than expected, carved deep into the hillside like a cave, with shelves holding mason jars that caught lamplight like captured stars. A narrow cot occupied one corner, blankets folded with military precision, suggesting this wasn't the space's first use as refuge from more than weather. The storm raged through the night with biblical intensity, but Ruth slept deeply for the first time in months. No sounds of Jacob's boots in the hallway, no whispered threats about her failures as a woman and wife. Just honest fury of wind against good timber, the kind of violence that came from nature rather than human malice. She woke to silence more ominous than the storm's rage and the distant murmur of voices that made her blood freeze in her veins. Pressing her ear to the cellar door, Ruth made out Bo's voice and at least two others, men with the hard vowels and righteous certainty of settlement folk. Her stomach clenched as she recognized Ezra Whitman's nasal drawl, sharp as broken glass and twice as cutting. "Tracks lead right to your door, McKenna." Whitman was saying, his voice carrying the sing-song cadence of a man who'd found religion and made it into a weapon. "Fresh horse prints, woman's footprints in the mud. You harboring fugitives now. I'm harboring peace and quiet." Bo replied, and Ruth could hear the dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "Something you seem determined to disturb with your social call." Ruth crept up the steps and put her eye to a gap in the door frame. Through the crack, she could see three men standing in Bo's yard, like harbingers of everything she'd tried to escape. Whitman, tall and pale as a praying mantis, flanked by two farmers she recognized from Jacob's inner circle, Caleb Morrison and Samuel Cross, men who'd traded their souls for the privilege of serving a self-appointed prophet. But it was what she glimpsed in their eyes that made her stomach turn the glassy certainty of zealots who believed God rode with them into battle. More dangerous than hired guns, because they couldn't be bought, reasoned with, or frightened into retreat. These were men who would kill with prayers on their lips and righteousness in their hearts. Jacob Lacey's wife has escaped divine judgment. Whitman continued, his pale hands resting on the butt of his Colt .45. She was buried by righteous hands for the sin of barrenness, but Satan himself must have dug her free from her appointed grave. That's so. Bo's laugh was sharp as broken glass, carrying undertones that made Ruth's skin crawl with remembered fear. "Seems like a waste of good digging effort. Maybe your God should invest in better gravediggers next time." Young Caleb Morrison bristled at the blasphemy, his hand dropping toward his sidearm with the eager hunger of youth seeking to prove itself through violence. "You watch your tongue, McKenna. Some words can't be taken back. Neither can some deeds." Bo replied, his own hand drifting casually toward his hip. Funny how that works. Samuel Cross, older and more cautious than his companions, held up a weathered hand for peace. His voice was deep and steady, the kind that carried weight in church meetings and town councils. Now, we're all Christians here. No need for hard words between neighbors. Neighbors. Bo's voice carried genuine amusement now. That what we're calling trespassers these days, Samuel must have missed that sermon. Whitman's hand tightened on his gun, and Ruth saw the calculation in his pale eyes, the weighing of risk against righteousness. The decision tree that ended with blood, spilled in service of higher purposes. "Careful, McKenna. Your blasphemy already cost you one woman. Hate to see you lose this spread, too." The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, heavy with promise and possibility. Ruth watched Bo weigh his options, knowing he was outgunned and outnumbered by men who'd convinced themselves that God endorsed their violence. The smart play would be surrender, give her up. Let Jacob's men finish what they'd started, save his own skin and what remained of his broken-down ranch. But Bo McKenna had apparently never learned to make smart plays. "Search if you want," he said, stepping aside with theatrical courtesy. "But no, I've got a shotgun in the house and a short temper for folks who overstay their welcome." They searched with the thoroughness of professional manhunters, turning over everything that could hide a woman or evidence of her passage. House, barn, chicken coop, where Bo's half-dozen hens squawked indignant protests at having their routines disturbed. They checked feed bins and hay lofts, poked through the tool shed, and even climbed into the windmill housing looking for any trace of Jacob's escaped wife. But they never thought to check the root cellar, perhaps, because it looked too obvious, too exposed to casual observation. Or perhaps because men like Whitman couldn't imagine a woman choosing to hide underground after escaping one grave, the psychology was too foreign, too removed from their understanding of feminine nature. Ruth listened to their boots stomping overhead, their voices growing increasingly frustrated as the search yielded nothing. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, she heard them gathering in the yard for final consultation. She was here. Whitman said, his voice tight with certainty and frustration. Tracks don't lie, and neither does horse sweat. That gelding's been ridden hard and recent. Maybe she moved on. Caleb suggested, his youthful voice bright with the possibility of extended hunt. Could be halfway to Colorado by now. Could be, Samuel agreed thoughtfully. But Jacob wants her found, and Jacob don't take disappointment well. We keep looking, keep asking questions. She'll surface eventually, they always do. After they left, Bo waited a full hour before retrieving Ruth from her hiding place. She found him in his kitchen, methodically cleaning his shotgun, with the focused attention of a man preparing for war. The weapon gleamed under lamplight, freshly oiled and loaded, speaking of decisions made and lines drawn in dust that couldn't be uncrossed. "They'll be back," she said without preamble, settling into a chair that creaked under her slight weight. "I know." Bo didn't look up from his work, his hands steady as he ran the cleaning rod through the barrel. Question is what happens when they do. Ruth moved to the window, watching dust clouds mark the rider's retreat across landscape that looked peaceful in afternoon light, but held the promise of violence like a loaded gun. The storm had washed the air clean, leaving behind a sky so blue it seemed like a promise of better things, the kind of promise this country specialized in breaking. "You should have given me up," she said quietly, studying his reflection in the glass. $500 would save this place, pay your debts. Give you a fresh start somewhere Jacob's poison can't reach. Probably. Bo set the shotgun aside and met her eyes directly for the first time since the searchers had left. "But I've been living with ghosts for 3 years now. Figured I could handle one more, especially one that's still breathing. This isn't about redemption, McKenna. This is about survival, yours and mine. Sometimes they're the same thing." He stood and moved to join her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring in a way Ruth hadn't expected. "Besides, I made Sarah a promise the day I buried her. Swore I'd never let Jacob hurt another woman the way he hurt her. Giving you up would break that promise, and I've broken enough of them already." Ruth studied his profile, trying to read the geography of old wounds and hard choices written in the lines around his eyes. She'd spent 5 years married to a man who never questioned his own righteousness, who saw the world in absolutes, defined by divine mandate. Bo McKenna seemed to live in gray spaces between certainties, and she wasn't sure if that made him dangerous or trustworthy. "They know I'm alive now," she said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest like a tumor. "Jacob won't rest until he finds me. He can't afford to. Outcast. Bo leaned forward, his intensity sudden and focused like a hunter scenting prey. "What makes you worth this much trouble? What do you know that's got Jacob Lacey so spooked he's willing to risk federal attention?" Ruth felt the weight of secrets pressing against her chest like stones in a drowning woman's pockets. The truth about Sarah's death. The real reason Jacob had chosen her for his wife. The documents hidden in his study that could bring down half the territory's power structure. The women who'd died, the children who'd been corrupted, the whole rotten edifice built on lies and held together with scripture and violence. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not yet. Not until she knew whether Bo McKenna was her salvation or just another kind of grave, deeper and more comfortable than the last. "I know enough," she said, finally turning away from the window and the distant threat it represented. Enough to make him desperate. And desperate men do desperate things to desperate women. Outside, a red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, riding thermals with patient grace. Ruth watched it hunt, admiring the predator's focus and efficiency. In this country, she was learning everything was either hunter or prey, and the distinction could change in a heartbeat. She was tired of being prey. The question now was whether she had the courage to become something else. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that wore on their nerves, like Chinese water torture, slow, steady, inexorable. Riders appeared on distant ridges with increasing frequency, close enough to be seen, but too far for rifle range. Never approaching directly, just making their presence felt like a slowly tightening noose around Bo's property. Ruth began to recognize them by silhouette against the harsh sky. There was young Caleb Morrison, Jacob's eager nephew, sitting his horse with the restless energy of youth, yearning to prove itself through violence. Samuel Cross, the settlement's blacksmith, solid and patient as the anvil where he'd forged her burial chains. And always Ezra Whitman, pale and methodical, as death itself, coordinating the hunt with precision that spoke of military training or natural talent for patient cruelty. They're waiting for something. Ruth observed one evening, watching familiar figures through a gap in the curtains. The riders had been there since dawn, just sitting their horses like scarecrows, with heartbeats close enough to remind her of her precarious situation, but far enough away to avoid giving Bo legal justification for violence. Winter. Bo replied from his place at the kitchen table, where he was trying to make impossible numbers balance in his account ledger. Snow closes the pass's limits escape routes. Jacob's playing a longer game than simple revenge. Ruth felt the wisdom of it, like ice forming in her veins. Jacob had always been patient when patience served his purposes, willing to let time and weather become his allies. Soon the high country would be impassable, trapping her in a shrinking circle of possibilities until spring thaw gave him a captive audience for whatever final judgment he had planned. "We need to do something before," Ruth began. But the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut her words short. A single rider this time, coming fast across the prairie with urgency that set Bo's hand drifting toward his shotgun. Ruth retreated to the root cellar with practiced efficiency, listening through the crack in the door as boots hit the ground and a stranger's voice called out greeting. "Name's Porter," the man announced. "Tom Porter, federal marshal, looking for a woman who might be in these parts." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of the badge pinned to his vest through the gap in the door. Jacob had escalated beyond informal justice, bringing federal authority into play. The stakes had just risen exponentially, and she wasn't sure Bo understood the implications. "Federal marshal." Bo repeated his voice, carefully neutral. "Long way from anywhere official." "What brings you to my doorstep?" "Ruth Lacey, Jacob Lacey's wife. Word is she escaped legal custody and might be hiding in this area." Porter shifted in his saddle, and Ruth noticed something odd about his posture, too straight, too formal, like a man wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. "Got a warrant signed by Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. Charges include theft, adultery, and conspiracy against territorial order." The creativity of it almost made Ruth laugh, if laughter hadn't died in her throat months ago. Jacob had transformed her escape into a federal case, painting her as a criminal rather than a victim. Brilliant in its simplicity, now anyone who helped her would be harboring a fugitive subject to arrest and prosecution under territorial law. "Serious charges," Bo observed. "What makes you think she'd come this way?" "Direction of the tracks from her last known location. And the fact that you've got personal history with her husband, man, might figure you'd take her in out of spite or misplaced charity." Bo was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth held her breath, knowing this was the moment that would determine whether she lived as a free woman or died as a federal fugitive. $500 would save his ranch, pay his debts, give him the fresh start he desperately needed. It was enough money to tempt a saint, and Bo McKenna was no saint. "Haven't seen Jacob Lacey's wife," Bo said finally, and Ruth almost wept with relief at the careful phrasing. "But if I do, I'll be sure to let you know where to find her." It wasn't technically a lie he'd seen Ruth the woman, but perhaps not Ruth Lacey, the wife. The distinction was subtle, but important, a lifeline thrown in the language of careful truth. "Appreciate your cooperation," Porter said, touching his hat brim. "There's a reward, by the way. $1,000 for information leading to her capture, dead or alive." The amount made Ruth's stomach clench with new fear. $1,000 was more than most families saw in 5 years, enough to buy loyalty from almost anyone in the territory. Jacob wasn't just hunting her now, he was making it profitable for others to join the hunt. After Porter left, Bo stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the dust cloud marking the marshal's departure. When he finally came to the cellar, his face was grim with new understanding. "That $1,000, he said without preamble. "Jacob's raised the stakes. You could have claimed it." Ruth replied quietly. "Still could. I wouldn't blame you. A man's got to survive, and survival costs money in this country." "I've thought about it," Bo admitted, and his honesty was more comforting than false reassurance would have been. "God knows I've thought about it. But some things cost more than money, and some debts can't be paid with blood money." That night, they rode out to Sarah's grave, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. The headstone glowed pale in the moonlight, a lonely monument to love, destroyed by other men's poison. Bo dismounted and stood before it, with the reverence of a man visiting a shrine to his own failures. "Tell me about Sarah," Ruth said softly, needing to understand the full scope of what Jacob had destroyed. "Tell me what really happened to her." Bo was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with old pain, like a wound that had never properly healed. "She was carrying our first child. 7 months along, healthy as a horse, planning names and knitting blankets." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That's when Jacob started his visits, coming by with fresh bread and scripture, filling her head with fear about contamination and divine displeasure." Ruth felt pieces of Jacob's strategy clicking into place with horrible clarity. Said if she associated with you, showed you kindness, the curse might spread to her unborn baby. Bo continued, his voice growing stronger with anger. "Kept visiting, kept preaching, kept poisoning her mind with guilt and terror, until she couldn't sleep for fear of damning our child through simple human decency. So she stopped speaking to me." Ruth whispered, remembering the gradual cooling of their friendship, the way Sarah's eyes had begun to slide away whenever they met. More than that, she started believing she was cursed too, that the baby was already doomed because she'd been kind to you. The guilt ate her alive, Ruth. She lost the child in her 7th month, and 3 days later, she walked into the river with stones in her pockets. The night air was suddenly too thin, too cold. Ruth felt Sarah's death settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket, another life destroyed by Jacob's manipulations, another soul crushed in service of his twisted vision of righteousness. He killed her just as surely as if he'd held her head underwater. Bo said, his voice breaking with emotion he'd held in check for 3 years. Used her own faith against her, turned her love for our child into a weapon that destroyed them both. And now he's trying to kill me the same way, slowly, systematically, using the whole territory as his weapon. Bo turned to look at her directly, and in the moonlight, she could see the fury building behind his eyes, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The question is why? What makes you dangerous enough to justify this kind of effort? What do you know that's worth $1,000 and federal involvement? Ruth closed her eyes, feeling the momentum of truth building like an avalanche that had been waiting 3 years to fall. There was no safe harbor left in silence, no protection in secrets that had already cost too many lives. "Because I'm not his first wife," she said quietly, the words carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "And Sarah wasn't his first victim." The silence stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss, heavy with implications that would change everything. Bo stood perfectly still, But Ruth could feel something seismic happening inside him and the fundamental assumptions of his world rearranging themselves around this new and terrible truth. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Jacob's had 3 wives before me. All died under mysterious circumstances, fever accidents, acts of God." Ruth's voice grew stronger as the words came fed by years of suppressed truth. "But I found his journal, Bo, hidden in a false bottom of his study desk. I can read you see my father was a preacher before the consumption took him, believed women should know scripture as well as men." "What did you find?" Bo's voice was barely above a whisper. "Confessions. Detailed accounts of how he killed each wife when they failed to give him sons. How he staged their deaths to look natural, even holy." Ruth met his eyes directly, seeing her own pain reflected there. The first wife, Mary, supposedly died of fever. The journal describes how he poisoned her slowly with arsenic, making it look like wasting sickness. The second, Elizabeth, allegedly fell from her horse and broke her neck. Jacob wrote about loosening her saddle cinch before she rode out to check the cattle alone. And the third, Bo asked, though Ruth could see in his face that he already knew. "Anna, your sister Anna." The words hung in the cold air like an executioner's blade. Bo turned away, his shoulders shaking with something that might have been grief or rage or both. When he spoke again, his voice was barely human. "Anna died in childbirth. Natural causes. The whole settlement grieved with Jacob for his loss. The journal says otherwise." Ruth's voice was steady now, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Says he gave her something to induce early labor when the baby wasn't ready to survive. Says he wanted to try again with someone younger, more fertile. Says Anna fought him at the end, realized what was happening, but it was too late." Bo was quiet for a long time, absorbing the magnitude of what she'd told him. Finally, he looked back at Sarah's headstone, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute resolve. "That bastard murdered my sister, murdered her baby. And then he married me because I was there when Anna died. I was the midwife's assistant, saw things that didn't make sense at the time, the medicine he gave her, the way she convulsed, the color of the blood." Ruth moved closer, close enough to see tears tracking down Bo's face in silver lines. "He married me to keep me quiet, to control what I knew. But when I couldn't give him children, he decided you were more dangerous alive than dead." "Exactly. The journal is still in his study if we could get to it. We'd have enough evidence to hang him." Bo's voice carried a new note now, not just grief, but purpose. "If we lived long enough to present it." But their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast through the darkness. Bo drew his gun as 3 figures materialized out of the night, but relaxed slightly when he recognized the lead rider, Jim Peterson. He called out to his nearest neighbor, a grizzled rancher who'd never had much use for Jacob's brand of righteousness. "What brings you out so late?" "Trouble, Bo." Peterson replied, his voice grim. "Jacob's called for a gathering tomorrow night. Says he's got proof of corruption in the community, evidence of Satan's influence among God-fearing folk. Word is he's planning something big." Ruth felt ice forming in her veins. Jacob was moving to his endgame, whatever that might be. "There's more." Peterson continued, glancing nervously at Ruth. "He's got that federal marshal staying at his place now, along with a little girl he says is the marshal's daughter. Cute little thing about 10 years old. But there's something about her that doesn't sit right." Ruth's blood turned to water. "What did you say about the child?" "Pretty little girl, blonde braids, blue eyes. Calls Jacob Papa sometimes, though she corrects herself quick. Porter says she's his daughter, but..." Peterson shrugged. Something feels off about the whole arrangement. Ruth exchanged glances with Bo, both of them thinking the same thing. Jacob had always been fond of collecting strays, especially children he could mold to his purposes. But this felt different, more calculated. "We need to get closer to that settlement," Ruth said quietly. "I need to see this child." "Too dangerous," Bo replied. "Jacob's got too many eyes watching." "Then we find another way." Ruth's voice carried a new determination. "Because if I'm right about what Jacob's planning, that little girl might be in more danger than any of us." The opportunity came 3 days later when the child herself appeared at their door. Ruth was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard Bo's voice raised in surprise and greeting. She peered around the corner to see a small figure on a spotted pony, a girl of perhaps 10 years with cornflower blue eyes and blonde braids, carrying herself with the kind of poise that spoke of adult attention and careful training. Papa had to go to Cheyenne on business. The child was explaining to Bo as he helped her down from her mount. "Left me with the Hendersons, but their baby took sick, and Mrs. Henderson said she couldn't manage another mouth to feed. Marshal Porter said you might put me up for a few days, seeing as how you and Papa served together in the war." "Papa." Ruth felt warning bells chiming in her mind. Federal marshals didn't usually let their young daughters call other men "Papa," no matter how close their friendship. "Yeah, of course you can stay a little bit," Bo said, using a nickname that came too easily to be new. "You remember the rules: no wandering off alone, help with chores, mind your manners." "Yes, Uncle Bo," the girl said solemnly, then broke into a grin that could have powered a small town. Uncle Bo. Another piece of the puzzle, suggesting relationships and history that didn't quite fit the story they'd been told. Ruth retreated deeper behind the laundry line, not wanting to complicate an already delicate situation with her presence. But as she watched the child settle into the ranch routine with remarkable ease, Ruth noticed things that made her skin crawl. The way Maggie's eyes never quite matched her smile. How she asked seemingly innocent questions about household routines and recent visitors. The adult intelligence that occasionally flickered behind her childish manner, like glimpses of something much older and more calculating than her years should allow. "You're very pretty," Maggie announced over supper that first night, studying Ruth with frank assessment that felt uncomfortably like evaluation. "But you look sad. Are you sick?" "I was sick," Ruth replied carefully, aware of Bo's watchful presence. "But I'm getting better." "That's good. Mama was sick too before she went to heaven. Papa says sometimes being sick isn't your fault. It's just what happens when the world gets too heavy for your heart to carry." It was a remarkably sophisticated observation for a 10-year-old, delivered with the kind of practiced sincerity that made Ruth's nerves sing with warning. But perhaps she was reading too much into innocent words, seeing threats where none existed. It was Maggie who found the letter that changed everything. 3 days into her stay, she was helping Ruth organize Bo's chaotic bookshelf when a folded paper fell from between the pages of a worn Bible. The child picked it up with helpful eagerness, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. Who's Anna?" she asked, beginning to read aloud with careful pronunciation. "Her dear Anna. I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. The harvest has been bountiful this year, and I find myself thinking often of our conversations about God's plan for families." Ruth's blood turned to ice as the child continued reading in her clear, innocent voice. "Sarah McKenna has been expressing doubts about her worthiness as a mother. She fears that her association with certain corrupted individuals might taint her unborn child. The solution we discussed seems increasingly necessary. A woman of questionable virtue living so close to our settlement poses risks to all righteous families. Perhaps it is time to implement our plan to remove this obstacle to community harmony. Your cooperation in this matter would be most appreciated, as would your discretion. Signed, your devoted friend in Christ, Jacob Lacey." The letter fluttered from Maggie's hands as Ruth sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling with the implications. Anna, Bo's sister Anna, hadn't been Jacob's victim. She'd been his accomplice. "What does it mean?" Maggie asked with what seemed like childish curiosity. But Ruth caught something else in her voice, a note of calculation that didn't belong in a 10-year-old's mouth. "It means," Ruth said slowly, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity, "that I've been wrong about everything." Bo chose that moment to return from his afternoon chores, stopping short when he saw Ruth's ashen face and the damning letter in Maggie's small hands. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert to danger. Ruth held up the letter with trembling fingers. "Your sister, Anna. She wasn't Jacob's victim, she was working with him." Bo read the letter twice, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally a sick understanding that drained the color from his skin like a slow poison. "This doesn't make sense," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It makes perfect sense." Ruth replied, memory fragments clicking together like chambers in a revolver. "Anna encouraged Jacob's courtship of me. Said he was a good man who deserved a faithful wife. She was the one who told me about his previous wives' tragic deaths. But she made it sound like divine judgment rather than murder." The silence in the room was deafening. Even Maggie seemed to sense that she'd stumbled into adult territory too dangerous for children, though Ruth noticed the girl was watching their reactions with uncomfortably sharp attention. She helped him choose victims. Ruth continued, her voice gaining strength as understanding crystallized. "Women with no family, no connections. No one who would ask hard questions. Anna provided legitimacy. What community would suspect a man whose own sister vouched for his character?" Bo sank into a chair as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. "But she died too. Her and the baby. Because she knew too much. Because she'd outlived her usefulness. Or because she threatened to expose him." Ruth stood and began pacing, her mind racing through implications. "Think about it. Jacob needed someone to help him select victims, provide social cover, make the matches seem natural and blessed. Anna was perfect for that role until she became inconvenient. Or until she got pregnant and Jacob decided she might pass his secrets to her child." Bo said quietly. "Exactly. So he eliminated her the same way he eliminated the others, but this time he had to be more careful. She was your sister, a respected woman. The death had to look completely natural." Maggie, who had been listening with the wide-eyed fascination of a child witnessing adult catastrophe, suddenly spoke up. "Papa says bad people sometimes pretend to be good people to fool everyone else. Is that what Anna did?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. And Ruth felt another piece of the puzzle shift into place. She looked at the child, really looked at her, and saw something that made her blood freeze. Those cornflower blue eyes weren't just calculating. They were familiar. "Yes, sweetheart," Ruth said carefully, studying Maggie's face for any flicker of reaction. "That's exactly what Anna did. Just like some people pretend to be marshals when they're really something else entirely." Maggie's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle straightening, a tension that spoke of readiness rather than relaxation. "What are you saying?" Bo asked, but Ruth could see in his face that he was beginning to understand. "I'm saying that Marshal Porter has been dead for weeks." Ruth said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And I'm saying that our little visitor here isn't who she claims to be." For a moment, the child maintained her innocent facade. Then slowly a smile spread across her face, cold, calculating, utterly without warmth. When she spoke again, her voice was different, older, carrying the same cadence Ruth had heard in Jacob's sermons. "Hello, Ruth," Maggie said, and the pretense fell away like a discarded mask. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Papa said you were cleverer than the others, but I was starting to have my doubts." The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Jacob hadn't just been a killer. He'd been breeding his own instruments of manipulation, raising a child to be his perfect weapon. "You're his daughter," Ruth said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Margaret Lacey." The child replied with perfect composure, her blue eyes, Jacob's eyes bright with intelligence that had nothing to do with innocence. Papa thought Porter was a better name for traveling, less conspicuous than Lacey given recent events. Bo was reaching for his gun, but Maggie held up one small hand with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I wouldn't," she said calmly. "Papa's watching the house. One shot, one scream, one wrong move, and this place will be surrounded before you can blink." Ruth felt the walls closing in around them, the carefully laid trap finally springing shut. "What do you want?" "What Papa wants." Maggie replied, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of a true believer. "Justice, righteousness, the natural order restored." She paused, tilting her head like a bird, considering prey. "And you, Ruth Lacey, standing trial for your crimes against God and man." Outside, as if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the evening air. Many riders moving with purpose and coordination. Jacob's final gambit was beginning, and Ruth realized with crystal clarity that they'd been played from the very beginning, not just outmaneuvered, but choreographed like dancers in someone else's deadly ballet. "The real Marshal Porter?" Bo asked, his voice hollow with understanding. Maggie's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something that might have been genuine emotion beneath the manufactured composure. "Papa killed him when he started asking too many questions about the warrant. Been wearing his badge for weeks." Ruth felt pieces of Jacob's endgame clicking into place with the precision of a well-oiled trap. The federal marshal, the warrant, the siege, all of it orchestrated to corner them exactly where Jacob wanted them, with his own daughter serving as the perfect bait. But there was something else in Maggie's eyes now, something that looked almost like uncertainty. For the first time since Ruth had known her, the child looked her age, not calculating, but lost. "Why tell us this?" Ruth asked gently. "Why drop the pretense now?" Maggie was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Because Papa's plan is almost finished, and he wanted you to understand how completely you've been beaten before." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Before what, Maggie?" "Before you die," the child whispered. And for the first time, she sounded like what she was, a 10-year-old girl who'd been taught to see murder as righteousness and manipulation as love. Outside, Jacob's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Ruth Lacey, you have corrupted good men and perverted the natural order. Come forth and face the judgment you have so long avoided." Ruth moved to the window and felt her heart stop. Jacob Lacey sat his horse in Bo's yard like a general surveying a conquered battlefield, flanked by 8 armed men, including Ezra Whitman and Caleb Morrison. But it wasn't the show of force that made her blood freeze. It was the expression on Jacob's face. He looked like a man who'd finally cornered his prey after a long and patient hunt. But Ruth had one more card to play, one final gambit that might turn Jacob's own weapon against him. "Maggie," she said quietly, turning back to the child. "What happens to you after Papa gets what he wants?" For the first time since dropping her mask, Maggie looked uncertain. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you know too much. You've seen too much. You're the one witness who can connect Papa to Marshal Porter's murder, to all the lies and manipulation." Ruth knelt down to the child's eye level, speaking with gentle urgency. "What do you think he's going to do with you once I'm dead and buried?" The uncertainty in Maggie's eyes deepened into something that might have been fear. She was smart enough to understand the implications, old enough to recognize the pattern of Jacob's previous eliminations. "He wouldn't," she said. But the words lacked conviction. "I'm his daughter, his own blood. So is Anna, in a way," Ruth replied softly. "And look what happened to her when she became inconvenient." Outside, Jacob's voice rose in righteous proclamation, calling for Ruth's surrender and final judgment. But inside the ranch house, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. A child's dawning understanding that she might be the next victim of the monster she'd been raised to serve. The question now was whether that understanding would come in time to save any of them. The siege began at first light with the sound of splintering wood and the acrid smell of smoke. Ruth woke in the root cellar to distant gunfire, and Bo's voice shouting warnings that were swallowed by wind and the crackle of flames. She'd spent the night underground while Bo tried to secure their defenses, but dawn had brought Jacob's final solution. If he couldn't take Ruth alive, he'd burn her out and claim her charred remains as divine justice. The barn went up first, orange flames licking toward a sky the color of dried blood. Bo's few remaining cattle scattered in panic as smoke billowed across the yard like fog from hell itself. Ruth climbed the cellar steps and peered through a crack in the door, counting muzzle flashes from the rocks above the house. At least 8 men positioned with military precision rather than the wild enthusiasm of amateur zealots. Ruth. Bo's voice carried from the kitchen window. They've got us surrounded. No way out except through them. She could hear the controlled desperation beneath his steady tone. This wasn't a fight they could win through superior firepower. Jacob had brought enough men to end this decisively, and positioned them with the patience of a spider who'd finally lured his prey into the web. But Ruth had learned something during her years as Jacob's wife. Desperate situations sometimes called for solutions that decent people wouldn't consider. "Where's Maggie?" she called back, fighting her way up the cellar steps against the weight of her own fear. "Tied up in the bedroom." Little Snake tried to signal her father with a mirror when the shooting started. At least that variable was contained. Though Ruth suspected the child's role in this drama was far from over. Maggie had revealed herself too easily, too completely. There had to be more to Jacob's plan than simple, overwhelming force. A bullet spanged off the cellar door, close enough to spray Ruth with splinters. She ran in a crouch toward the house, using smoke from the burning barn as cover. More bullets whined overhead, but the shooters were firing blind through the haze, more interested in containment than accuracy. She burst through the kitchen door as Bo was reloading his rifle, his face streaked with soot and grim determination. "We need to break their containment," she said without preamble. Bo stared at her as if she'd suggested they grow wings and fly to California. "Ruth, there's 8 men out there with rifles. Breaking anything means going through all of them. Not all of them. Just enough to create chaos." Ruth moved to the window and studied the tactical situation with eyes that had learned to see through Jacob's manipulations. Jacob's positioned himself on that rise about 200 yards out, close enough to direct the action, far enough back to avoid personal danger. Classic commander's position. Bo agreed grudgingly, which means he's a coward, and cowardice is always a weakness we can exploit. Ruth turned from the window, pieces of a plan forming in her mind, like crystal growing from solution. "I'm going to give him exactly what he wants me, walking out of this house with my hands up. That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to get close enough to end this." Ruth met his eyes directly. "Jacob's vain Bo. He needs to personally oversee my humiliation, needs to be the one who delivers final judgment. That vanity is going to kill him." Bo studied her face, seeing something there that made him pause. Ruth had the look of a woman who'd made peace with terrible choices, who'd calculated the cost of survival and found it acceptable. "You've got a plan," he said. "I've got half a plan. The other half depends on you trusting me completely and doing exactly what I say when I say it." Another volley of shots peppered the house, sending splinters flying from the window frame. The smell of smoke was getting stronger as wind shifted, carrying fire from the barn toward the house itself. Time was running out in multiple ways. "What do you need me to do?" Bo asked. Ruth pulled him away from the window and spoke quickly, outlining a strategy that was equal parts desperation and calculation. Bo's expression cycled through disbelief, admiration, and the kind of grim acceptance that comes when all other options have been exhausted. "It's insane," he said when she finished. "Insane enough to work. The question is whether you trust me enough to try it." Bo looked toward the bedroom where Maggie was secured, then back at Ruth. Outside, Jacob's voice continued its litany of righteous condemnation, each word another nail in the coffin he was building for all of them. "Sarah trusted you," Bo said quietly. "Even when Jacob was poisoning her mind, she never stopped believing you were a good woman caught in bad circumstances. If it's good enough for Sarah, it's good enough for me." Ruth felt something warm bloom in her chest, trust after years of living where every word was a potential trap. "Then let's give Jacob Lacey what he deserves." The plan required precise timing and faith that vanity would overcome caution. Ruth would surrender herself, allowing Jacob's men to take her prisoner while projecting complete defeat. But the surrender would be theater designed to get her close enough to Jacob for the real work to begin. Bo would wait exactly 10 minutes, then create a diversion at the house's rear, while simultaneously releasing Maggie-controlled chaos that would draw attention away from the rise where Jacob waited. In the confusion that followed, Ruth would implement the second phase of their desperate gambit. It was audacious, probably suicidal, and absolutely dependent on Jacob's need to personally deliver the coup de grace. Ruth walked to the front door and paused her hand on the latch. Through the wood, she could hear Jacob's men calling to each other, coordinating positions, preparing for whatever came next. She thought about Sarah, about Anna, about all the women who died to feed Jacob's appetites. "For Sarah," she whispered. "For all of them." Bo agreed. Ruth opened the door and stepped into the smoke-hazed yard with her hands raised high above her head. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Gunfire ceased, as if someone had thrown a switch, replaced by Jacob's triumphant voice. "Ruth Lacey, at last you show wisdom. Come forward and accept the judgment you have earned through sin and stubbornness." She walked slowly across the yard, each step measured and deliberate, giving Bo time to get into position while projecting the image of total surrender. Jacob stood on his rise like a black-clad prophet, arms spread wide in a gesture meant to suggest divine authority, but looking more like a scarecrow in expensive clothes. Ezra Whitman and Samuel Cross moved down from their positions to escort her rifles trained with casual competence. But Ruth noticed something else. Young Caleb Morrison, hanging back his face, troubled, his gun lowered. Perhaps doubt was finally creeping into Jacob's perfect brotherhood. "Hands behind your back," Whitman ordered as they reached her. Ruth complied, feeling rough rope bite into her wrists. The binding was professional work, tight enough to restrict movement, but not so tight as to cause immediate damage. These men had experience with prisoners, but Ruth had experience with enduring discomfort in service of larger goals. They marched her up the rise toward Jacob, who waited with the patience of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. As they climbed, Ruth could see the full scope of his operation. Men positioned at every escape route, horses ready for rapid pursuit supplies, sufficient for extended siege. This wasn't the work of religious zealots. This was military precision disguised as divine justice. "My dear Ruth," Jacob said as she was forced to her knees before him. Up close, he looked older than she remembered, his face carved into harsh lines by years of righteous fury, his black hair streaked with premature white. But his eyes still burned with the fervent certainty of a man who believed God endorsed his every action. "Hello, Jacob," Ruth replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Still hiding behind other men's guns, I see." Jacob's smile was cold as winter stone. Still possessed of pride, even facing final judgment. "But then pride was always your particular sin, wasn't it, my dear?" He gestured to his men, who forced Ruth into the traditional position of supplication. The rocky ground bit into her knees through her dress, but she kept her back straight and her eyes fixed on Jacob's face. If this was to be her final performance, she intended to play it with dignity. "Before we proceed with divine justice," Jacob continued his voice, taking on the cadences of formal pronouncement, "certain confessions must be made. Certain truths spoken for the record and the edification of all present." Ruth felt pieces of his endgame clicking into place. This wasn't just about killing her. It was about creating a narrative that would justify not only her death, but everything that had led to this moment. Jacob needed her confession to legitimize his version of events, to transform murder into martyrdom. "What would you have me confess?" she asked. "Your adultery with Bo McKenna. Your theft of sacred documents from my private study. Your corruption of innocent minds with feminine wiles and sinful nature." Jacob's voice grew stronger with each accusation, feeding on its own righteousness. "Confess these sins before God and man, and perhaps your death will be swift rather than prolonged." The irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. Jacob was accusing her of his own crime's adultery, in the form of his serial murders theft, in his appropriation of his wife's property corruption, in his manipulation of children, like Maggie. But then, projection had always been Jacob's way of handling inconvenient truths. "I confess nothing," Ruth said clearly, her voice carrying across the rise for all to hear. "Because I have committed no crimes except the sin of surviving when you wanted me dead." Jacob's face darkened with the kind of rage that came from having his carefully constructed narrative challenged in public. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Ruth was meant to break, to beg, to validate his righteousness through her abasement. "Blasphemy," he hissed, drawing a pistol from beneath his coat. "Even facing death, you persist in your lies and manipulations. The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for years." Ruth replied, raising her voice so Jacob's men could hear every word. "About your wives, who died of natural causes. About the women who supposedly brought God's wrath upon themselves. About the federal marshal you murdered to steal his badge and authority." She could see uncertainty flickering across the faces of some of Jacob's followers. These were men who'd signed on to serve divine justice, not assist in cold-blooded murder. Ruth's words were seeds of doubt, and doubt was a powerful weapon against the kind of absolute certainty Jacob required from his disciples. But before Jacob could respond with violence, the sound of splintering wood and shouting voices erupted from the direction of the ranch house. Bo's diversion right on schedule. But with an unexpected addition, the high, clear voice of a child screaming in apparent terror. "Papa, Papa, help me. The bad man is trying to hurt me." Maggie's voice carrying perfectly across the distance with theatrical panic that would have done credit to a professional actress. Ruth felt pieces of a larger deception clicking into place. The child hadn't been trying to signal Jacob earlier. She'd been waiting for the right moment to become part of the performance. "What?" Jacob began, turning toward the commotion. Ruth had been waiting for exactly this moment of distraction. She rolled sideways off her knees and brought her bound hands forward, having worked the ropes loose during the march up the rise. But instead of going for Jacob's gun immediately, she did something unexpected. She grabbed Samuel Cross's rifle and swung it like a club into Caleb Morrison's legs, sending the young man tumbling down the rocky slope. Then she was rolling, scrambling, using the confusion and her smaller size to create chaos among men who'd expected either submission or a direct assault. "Kill her!" Jacob screamed, but his men were afraid of hitting each other in the melee. Ruth came up behind a boulder with Cross's rifle, but she didn't try to shoot anyone. Instead, she did something that stopped the violence immediately. She pointed the gun at Maggie, who had appeared at the edge of the rise, with theatrical tears streaming down her face. "One more step and your precious daughter dies." Ruth called out, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. The effect was electric. Every gun lowered as Jacob's men found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties. They'd been prepared to kill Ruth, but killing a child, even to save Jacob, was beyond most of them. "You wouldn't dare," Jacob said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time. "Try me," Ruth replied, and something in her tone made it clear she wasn't bluffing. "I've got nothing left to lose, Jacob. Nothing except the satisfaction of taking your weapon away from you before I die." For a moment, the tableau held Ruth with a gun on Maggie Jacob's men, frozen in confusion. Jacob himself caught between rage and calculation. It was Bo who broke the deadlock, appearing at the edge of the rise with his shotgun trained on Jacob. "Seems like we've got ourselves a standoff," he observed calmly. "Question is, how do we resolve it without everyone dying?" But Ruth already knew the answer. She'd been planning for this moment since she'd first realized what Maggie really was. Not just Jacob's daughter, but his victim corrupted from childhood into becoming something monstrous. "We resolve it," Ruth said quietly, "by telling the truth. All of it. Starting with you, Maggie." The child's theatrical tears had stopped, replaced by the cold calculation Ruth had glimpsed before. "I don't know what you mean. I mean the real reason you're here. Not as bait for a trap, but as Jacob's insurance policy. His final solution if everything else failed." Ruth kept the rifle trained on the child, but spoke to Jacob's men. "Tell them, Jacob. Tell them what you plan to do if you couldn't take me alive." Jacob's face was pale now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "I don't know what she's talking about. You were going to kill me, then kill Maggie, then claim I murdered a child before you stopped me. The perfect martyr story, Jacob Lacey, righteous defender of innocence, forced to kill a woman who'd murdered his own daughter." Ruth's voice was steady, carrying absolute conviction. "It would have made you untouchable, wouldn't it? The grieving father who'd sacrificed everything for justice." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Jacob's most loyal followers were staring at him with growing horror, beginning to understand the true scope of his manipulations. "And that's not true," Caleb Morrison said, struggling to his feet with obvious pain. "Uncle Jacob wouldn't hurt Maggie. Wouldn't he?" Ruth asked gently. "The same way he wouldn't hurt Anna McKenna or his other wives or Marshall Porter." She could see the doubt spreading like wildfire through Jacob's ranks. These were men who'd followed him out of genuine religious conviction, who'd believed they were serving God's will. The suggestion that their leader would murder his own child to maintain his power was shaking the very foundations of their faith. But it was Maggie herself who delivered the killing blow. "She's right," the child said quietly, her voice carrying none of its previous theater. "Papa told me the plan last night. If he couldn't make Ruth confess, he was going to shoot us both and claim she killed me when he tried to stop her." The words hit Jacob's followers like physical blows. Samuel Cross actually stepped backward, his rifle dropping to his side. Even Ezra Whitman looked shaken, his pale eyes darting between Jacob and Maggie with visible confusion. "Lies!" Jacob roared, raising his pistol toward Ruth. "All lies from corrupted tongues." But before he could fire, young Caleb Morrison did something that surprised everyone. He stepped between Jacob and his intended target, his own gun now pointed at the man he'd called uncle. "No more." Caleb said, his voice shaking but determined. "I won't be part of murdering a child no matter what she's done. This isn't justice, this is madness." Other men were nodding, lowering their weapons, stepping away from Jacob's position. The coalition of righteousness was crumbling before Ruth's eyes, destroyed by the truth of what their leader had become. But Jacob Lacey had one more card to play. "You think this ends it?" Jacob snarled, his pistol swinging wildly between Ruth Bo and his own mutinous followers. "You think exposing my methods changes anything? I am God's instrument, his chosen vessel for purifying this corrupt world." The mask of righteousness had finally slipped completely, revealing the madness that had always lurked beneath Jacob's scriptural facade. His eyes burned with the fever of absolute certainty, untouchable by doubt or reason. "Every woman I killed deserved her fate." He continued, his voice rising to a preacher's cadence. "Barren vessels corrupted flesh, obstacles to God's plan for righteous families. Anna understood. She helped me identify the tainted ones, the women who would poison good men's seed with their spiritual disease." Ruth felt sick, hearing the confirmation of her worst suspicions about Anna's willing participation. But she kept the rifle trained on Maggie, knowing that Jacob's followers were still listening, still capable of being swayed by his twisted logic. And Sarah McKenna. Jacob went on spittle flying from his lips. Weak-minded woman who let herself be contaminated by association with the barren one. Her death was justice, too natural consequence of spiritual corruption. That was too much for Bo McKenna. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged toward Jacob's shotgun, forgotten in favor of bare hands that wanted to feel the life drain from his wife's murderer. But Jacob was ready for him, swinging his pistol around with surprising speed for a man of his age. The gun went off between them, the bullet catching Bo in the shoulder and spinning him around. He went down hard on the rocky ground, blood spreading across his shirt like spilled paint. Bo! Ruth screamed, her careful control finally breaking. But even as she started toward him, she saw Jacob raising his pistol again, this time aimed at Bo's head. Enough. The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Samuel Cross, the settlement blacksmith, who'd been one of Jacob's most loyal followers. He stood with his rifle trained on Jacob, his weathered face carved into lines of disgust and betrayal. I followed you because I thought you were a man of God. But God don't murder children, and he sure don't shoot unarmed men in cold blood. Other men were nodding their weapons, now pointed at Jacob instead of Ruth. The revolution that had been building in their hearts finally found expression in action. Even Ezra Whitman, pale and shaken, had lowered his gun. But Jacob wasn't finished. With the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, he grabbed Maggie by the arm and pressed his pistol to her temple. "Stand down," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "All of you stand down, or the child dies." The effect was immediate. Every weapon lowered as decent men found themselves caught in an impossible situation. They might have lost faith in Jacob's righteousness, but they weren't willing to let a child die to stop him. Ruth felt the tactical situation shift around her like quicksand. Jacob had found his winning move, the one thing that would paralyze his opposition and give him time to escape or turn the tables completely. But he'd made one critical miscalculation. "Go ahead," Maggie said quietly, her voice carrying a coldness that made the surrounding adults shiver. "Pull the trigger, Papa. Show them what you really are." Jacob stared down at his daughter in confusion. "What?" "I said pull the trigger." Maggie's blue eyes, so like Jacob's own, were flat and emotionless as winter sky. "You were going to kill me anyway, weren't you? To make your story work, so do it now in front of everyone. Show them the kind of man they've been following." The child's words hit Jacob's remaining followers like physical blows. Whatever doubts they'd harbored about their leader's true nature evaporated in the face of this naked display of his willingness to murder his own blood. "Maggie," Jacob said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "You don't understand. This is necessary. God's work requires God's work." Maggie laughed, and the sound was terrible coming from a 10-year-old throat. "You taught me that God's work was justice, Papa, that the guilty had to be punished. Well, here we are." She twisted suddenly in his grasp, her small hands closing around the gun barrel and forcing it away from her head. "You're guilty, Papa, of murder, of lies, of turning me into something monstrous. And now it's time for your punishment." The struggle between father and daughter lasted only seconds, but it gave Ruth the opening she needed. She dropped Cross's rifle and dove toward them, her hands closing around Jacob's wrist as he fought to regain control of his weapon. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and fury, rolling across rocky ground as Jacob tried to bring his pistol to bear. Ruth could feel his superior strength beginning to tell, could see the cold calculation in his eyes, as he realized he was moments away from ending this permanently. But then Bo was there, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder, his left hand clamping down on Jacob's gun arm, while his right fist connected with the false prophet's jaw in a blow that carried 3 years of grief and rage. Jacob's head snapped back, his grip on the pistol loosening just enough for Ruth to tear it free. She rolled away and came up with the weapon pointed at his chest, her finger tight on the trigger. For a moment, the urge to pull that trigger was overwhelming. Jacob Lacey had murdered her friends, destroyed her life, turned her into a hunted animal. He'd corrupted his own child and poisoned an entire community with his twisted vision of righteousness. The world would be better off without him, and Ruth had every legal and moral justification for ending his life. But as she stared down at him, bloodied, beaten, stripped of his authority, and revealed as the pathetic madman he'd always been, Ruth made a different choice. Samuel. She called out, never taking her eyes off Jacob. "You still got those shackles in your wagon?" The blacksmith nodded grimly. "Always travel prepared for bringing in fugitives. Good, because we've got ourselves a genuine federal case here. Murder of a U.S. Marshal conspiracy fraud and about a dozen other charges that'll keep him busy until they stretch his neck." As Cross moved to secure Jacob with iron shackles that had been forged in his own shop, Ruth finally allowed herself to look around at the aftermath of their confrontation. Bo was wounded, but alive, his shoulder bleeding, but not life-threatening. Jacob's former followers stood in various stages of shock and disillusionment, coming to terms with how completely they'd been deceived. And Maggie sat on a boulder nearby, watching the proceedings with those eerily adult eyes. She looked like what she was, a 10-year-old girl who'd been shaped into something monstrous, but might still have enough humanity left to be saved. "What happens to me now?" the child asked quietly. Ruth studied her face, seeing both the calculated intelligence Jacob had cultivated and glimpses of the frightened child she might have been under different circumstances. "That depends," Ruth said carefully, "on whether you want to learn how to be something other than what he made you." For the first time since Ruth had known her, Maggie looked genuinely uncertain. "I don't know how to be anything else. Then we'll figure it out together," Ruth replied, making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, but knew she had to try. People can change, but it takes work and time and help from others who care enough to try. As the sun set over the Wyoming Badlands, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruth Lacey stood among the ruins of Jacob's kingdom and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate hope of mere survival, but the deeper hope of redemption for herself, for Bo, and perhaps even for the damaged child who'd been both weapon and victim in a war she'd never chosen to fight. The hardest battles, Ruth was learning, weren't always fought with guns and violence. Sometimes they were fought with patience and love, and the radical belief that even the most broken things could be made whole again. Falling action. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne had never seen such a spectacle, and likely never would again. Word of Jacob Lacey's arrest had spread across the territory like wildfire, drawing spectators from hundreds of miles away to witness the trial of the self-proclaimed prophet who'd used God's word to justify murder. Ruth sat in the witness chair for 3 days, telling her story to a packed courtroom that hung on every word. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Harrison from Denver, led her through the events with methodical precision that left no room for doubt about Jacob's guilt. "Mrs. Lacey," he said on the final day of testimony, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed silence. "In your opinion, how many women died because of the defendant's actions?" Ruth looked across the courtroom at Jacob, who sat chained between his court-appointed lawyers. He'd aged visibly during his weeks in custody, his black hair now more white than dark, his face gaunt with the reality of his situation. But his eyes still burned with undiminished certainty. "I can prove 4 murders directly from his journal," Ruth replied. "But I suspect there were women who died before he started keeping detailed records, or whose deaths he managed to make look so natural that no one ever questioned them. And his daughter, Margaret. What role did she play in these crimes?" Ruth glanced toward the back of the courtroom where Maggie sat between Bo and a territorial social worker. The child had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, but the legal system was still grappling with what to do with a 10-year-old accomplice to multiple murders. Maggie was as much a victim as anyone else. Ruth said carefully. Jacob shaped her from childhood to be his instrument, his weapon. She did terrible things, but she did them because she'd been taught that serving Jacob was the same as serving God. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady and certain. Guilty on all counts. Judge Morrison sentenced Jacob Lacey to death by hanging to be carried out at dawn on December 20th. As the sentence was read, Jacob finally broke his silence. "You think this ends it?" He called out, his voice cutting through the courtroom noise like a blade. "I am eternal. My righteousness will outlive your corruption. God's work continues beyond the grave." But even as he spoke, Ruth could see the defeat in his eyes. Stripped of his religious authority and faced with the reality of his crimes, Jacob was revealed as what he'd always been beneath the scripture and righteousness, a small, cruel man who'd used God's name to justify his appetite for control and violence. Ruth walked out of the courthouse into December snow, feeling lighter than she had in years, but the feeling was complicated by the weight of new responsibilities. Bo was waiting on the steps, his arm still in a sling from his shoulder, wound his face grim with concern. "What did the judge decide about Maggie?" he asked. "Temporary custody to us pending psychological evaluation and long-term placement recommendations." Ruth pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "They want to put her in an institution for difficult children. But I convinced them to give us 6 months to see if she can learn to be different." It wasn't an easy decision. Taking responsibility for Jacob's daughter felt like adopting a viper. But Ruth had seen glimpses of the frightened child beneath the calculated exterior. If there was any hope of saving what remained of Maggie's humanity, it lay in patient work by people who understood both trauma and redemption. The legal arrangements took weeks to finalize. Bo petitioned for temporary guardianship with Ruth listed as co-guardian and primary caregiver. The territorial authorities, eager to resolve the matter quietly and uncomfortable with the precedent of prosecuting a child for adult crimes, approved the arrangement with minimal scrutiny. On a cold morning in January, the 3 of them boarded a train, bound for Wyoming, carrying everything they owned in 2 battered suitcases and the accumulated weight of their shared traumas. Maggie pressed her face to the window as Cheyenne disappeared behind them, watching her old life fade into snow and distance. "Are you afraid?" Ruth asked, settling beside her. Maggie considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Yes, but it's a different kind of afraid than before. Before I was afraid of disappointing Papa, of not being what he needed me to be. Now I'm afraid of not knowing how to be anything else." "That's a good kind of afraid," Ruth said gently. "It means you're ready to learn." The train carried them through landscape transformed by winter, endless miles of snow-covered prairie broken by stands of bare cottonwoods and the occasional homestead hunkered down against the cold. It was harsh country, unforgiving to the weak or unprepared, but it was also clean. A place where people could start over if they had the courage to try. At dawn on December 20th, Jacob Lacey died at the end of a rope in the courthouse square. Ruth didn't attend the execution. She'd seen enough of death to last several lifetimes. Instead, she spent the morning with Maggie, who had woken from nightmares about her father's final moments. "Does this make me an orphan?" the child asked over breakfast, her voice carefully neutral. "No," Ruth replied, meeting her eyes directly. "It makes you free." Resolution and final surprise. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, winter releasing its grip on the Badlands, with reluctant fingers that left frost warnings well into April. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it a kind of healing that seemed to touch everything, the land, the people, and most surprisingly, the strange family that had coalesced around trauma and stubborn hope. Ruth stood in the garden behind the ranch house, watching Maggie plant seeds with the focused concentration she brought to everything these days. The child had grown in the months since Jacob's death, not just physically, but in ways that were harder to measure and more important to track. The carrots need to be deeper, Ruth suggested, gently kneeling beside her. About twice as deep as the seed is wide. Maggie nodded and adjusted her technique without the defensive anger that had marked her early weeks at the ranch. She'd learned to accept guidance, even correction, without interpreting it as criticism or threat. It was progress, though Ruth knew they had years of work ahead before the child could truly be called healed. The nightmares still came, sometimes accompanied by episodes where Maggie would revert to the calculating coldness Jacob had cultivated in her. But they were becoming less frequent, and more importantly, Maggie had begun to express distress about these lapses rather than pride in them. "I dreamed about Papa again last night," she said quietly, not looking up from her planting. "He was angry that I was learning to garden. Said it was women's work beneath the daughter of a prophet." "And what did you tell him?" Ruth asked. "I told him he was dead and I was alive, and that meant I got to decide what kind of work mattered." Maggie's voice carried a note of fierce satisfaction. "Then I woke up and he was gone." It was a small victory, but Ruth had learned to celebrate small victories. They were the building blocks of larger transformations, the tiny steps that eventually led to the possibility of real change. Bo emerged from the barn, his shirt streaked with honest sweat, his left arm moving more freely now that the shoulder had healed properly. The ranch was thriving under his renewed attention. The herd had grown, buildings were repaired, and there was talk of expanding into horse breeding come fall. "The letter came for you," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "From that lawyer in Cheyenne." Ruth opened it and read quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise, to something that might have been satisfaction. "The territorial government has decided what to do with Jacob's property. They're dissolving his settlement entirely, redistributing the land to the families who actually worked it. It was the right decision, the just decision. But it also represented an enormous logistical challenge. Someone would need to oversee the transition, ensure that Jacob's victims received fair treatment, help families transition from religious tyranny to self-governance. They want me to coordinate the process," Ruth continued. 6 months of travel, meeting with families, handling legal documentation. "When would you start?" Bo asked, and Ruth could hear carefully controlled disappointment in his voice. "Next month. But I was thinking—" She paused, looking at him, and then at Maggie, who was listening with the intense focus that had become her trademark. "I was thinking it might be good for all of us to go. Maggie could meet other children who've lived through similar experiences. You could help with the practical aspects of land distribution, and I could help rebuild something better from what Jacob destroyed." Bo nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom of it. They'd built something precious here at the ranch, a fragile family bound together by shared trauma and mutual healing. But perhaps it was strong enough now to carry beyond these boundaries, to help others find their own paths to recovery. "It would mean months of traveling," Ruth warned. "Living in temporary shelters, dealing with people who might blame us for Jacob's crimes. It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Bo replied. "And besides, we've gotten pretty good at handling difficult situations." Maggie stood up from her garden row, brushing dirt from her hands, with methodical precision. "Would there be other children like me?" she asked quietly. "Some," Ruth said honestly. "Children who've been hurt, who've learned to see the world in unhealthy ways, children who need to learn new ways of being. Could I help them? Could I teach them things I've learned about changing?" It was a remarkable question from a child who'd spent most of her short life learning to manipulate and deceive. The idea that her experiences might be used to help rather than harm seemed to genuinely excite her. "I think you could teach them a great deal," Ruth said carefully. "About healing, about the possibility of becoming something different than what other people made you." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table planning their journey, Ruth found herself thinking about endings and beginnings. A year ago, She'd been buried alive in the Badlands, left to die for the crime of being unable to bear children. Now she was planning to travel across the territory, helping to rebuild communities and heal the wounds Jacob had inflicted. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but then the best lives rarely were. "There's something else," Bo said, as they finished reviewing the legal documents. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a small wooden box that Ruth recognized as the one where he kept Sarah's few personal effects. From it, he withdrew a folded paper that looked official and important. "Deed to the ranch. I had the lawyer in Cheyenne draw up new papers. All 3 of our names are on it now." Ruth stared at the document, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. In a world where women had few legal rights, and children even fewer, he was giving them security permanence, a place they could always return to, no matter what else happened. "Bo, I can't." "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "This place belongs to all of us now. We're family, whatever that word means, and family takes care of each other." Maggie reached out with one small finger and touched her name on the deed, tracing the letters with wonder. "Margaret Lacey McKenna," she read aloud. "Is that really me?" "If you want it to be," Bo said gently. "Names are just words until we decide what they mean." Ruth felt tears pricking her eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming recognition of how far they'd all traveled from the people they'd been when this story began. Bo had transformed from a grief-stricken hermit into the kind of man who would risk everything for others. Maggie was learning to be a child instead of a weapon. And Ruth had learned that sometimes the only way to truly live was to climb out of your own grave. 2 weeks later, they loaded their wagon and set out across the territory carrying supplies and legal documents and the hard-won knowledge that healing was possible even in the harshest circumstances. Behind them, the ranch waited patiently for their return, a testament to the idea that broken things could be made whole with enough time and care. As they traveled, Ruth found herself thinking about all the women who would never make this journey, Sarah Anna Jacob's other wives, whose names she might never know. Their deaths couldn't be undone, their suffering couldn't be erased. But perhaps their memory could be honored by the lives that grew from the soil of their sacrifice. The wagon rolled through landscape, slowly coming alive, with spring-green grass pushing through patches of snow wildflowers blooming in unexpected places, the eternal cycle of death and renewal that defined this harsh country. "Ruth," Maggie said one evening as they made camp under a sky full of stars, "do you think people can really change, like completely change into something different?" Ruth looked up at the stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet, thinking about the question that had haunted all their lives. "I think change is possible, but it's not easy. It takes work and time and the willingness to be uncomfortable while you figure out who you're becoming. What if you change and then people don't believe you're different? What if they only see what you used to be?" It was a profound question from a child who was living the reality of trying to outrun her past. Ruth considered her answer carefully, knowing that Maggie would remember every word. "Then you keep changing anyway," she said finally. "Not for them, but for yourself. Because the person you're becoming matters more than the person you used to be, even if it takes the rest of the world a while to catch up." That sounds hard. It is hard. But so is staying the same when the same is something that hurts you and other people. At least when you're changing, you're moving towards something better instead of staying trapped in something that doesn't fit anymore. Later, as Bo banked the fire and Maggie settled into her bedroll, Ruth walked a little distance from camp to look back at the trail they'd traveled. Tomorrow, they would reach the first of Jacob's former settlements, where families waited for help in rebuilding their lives. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments when the weight of the past threatened to crush their fragile hope. But tonight, under the infinite sky of the American West, Ruth Lacey McKenna allowed herself to believe in the possibility of redemption. Not the violent, conditional kind Jacob had preached, but the quiet kind that grew in spaces between people who chose to love each other despite their wounds. Behind her, she could hear Bo's steady breathing and Maggie's soft whispers as the child told stories to the stars, not the calculating lies she'd been trained to tell, but genuine stories about the flowers she was learning to grow and the future she was trying to imagine for herself. The sounds of a family imperfect and scarred but real. The sounds of people who'd learned that sometimes the most radical act was simply choosing to survive and then choosing to help others do the same. In the distance, a coyote called across the Badlands, its voice carrying notes of loneliness and wild freedom. Ruth listened to the sound fade into silence, then turned back toward the warmth of their camp and the promise of tomorrow. The West had claimed many dreams, buried many hopes beneath its harsh beauty. But it had also taught her something valuable, that the strongest things grew in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the only way to find grace was to dig for it with your bare hands. As she settled into her own bedroll, Ruth made a final promise to the stars and the wind and the ghosts of all the women who'd walked this trail before her. She would live. Not just survive, but truly live with purpose, with joy, with the fierce determination of someone who'd earned her freedom by crawling out of her own grave. And she would help others do the same, one broken soul at a time, until the seeds of Jacob's corruption were finally overwhelmed by the garden of healing they were planting in its place. It was a promise she intended to keep for as long as the stars kept shining over the Wyoming Badlands, and broken people needed someone to show them the way toward something better.